if we indeed did not care at all what others thought about us, what would our lives look like? To what degree does it impact us and others? To what degree do we change and do we adjust based on the impression or the concerns about what others are doing, what others think about us? And as I said, is it healthy adjustment? Because obviously in any good relationship, a mutual relationship that's healthy, there's a mutual certain, even compromise and definitely accommodation that we have for each other that's healthy. It doesn't mean you get obliterated in the process. But the question is, where do you draw the line? When is it accommodation and when is it capitulation? When does it become something that really is not good for you because you're neglecting yourself in the face of, let's say, what some people call pleasers, to please others? And many people say very openly, I'm a pleaser. I don't like confrontation. I'd rather retreat and give in than to confront. And sometimes that it could be at great cost. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's actually a beautiful thing. So how do you know when to yield, when not to yield, and so on? So we have, of course, the famous statement of Hillel, which I'll be using throughout, and that is where he says this double message, where he says, Im ein ani li mili, if I'm not for myself, who'll be for me? And then he says the second half, Im ani la'atzmi, if I'm only for myself, mo ani, what am I? And they're right there, even though it's a beautiful poetic statement, but question is when do you rely on yourself and when do you depend on another? It's very nice that we have both, but when do you know when? Sometimes we often depend on others when we should really not be. And sometimes we're depending on ourselves when we shouldn't be doing that. We should be turning to another. So it's more complicated than just a statement like that. Now, when you take into account, even in the healthiest environment, in growing up in a healthy situation where you weren't judged or criticized or basically almost programmed to please and serve another, even there we have challenges to know where the self begins and where the other begins. When to conform, when not to conform, when to be me and when to yield or defer to another. But then when you throw into the equation the complicated part, which is that we grow up in environments and in homes and in schools that are not always that healthy. So that's where it really gets messy, because then we don't even have healthy boundaries. You can grow up in a home where, and this is not uncommon, where a mother especially, or a father, puts a lot more pressure on the child and demands, and you become someone that you're just simply making them happy, and you're terrified of them getting upset. And in many, many ways, it essentially impedes your own growth. One of the beautiful things, if you see, let's say, if it's just in the garden and plants, even when, let's say, a tree sheds seeds, or any plant sheds seeds, so the seeds start growing, and there's a mystery that even scientists can't figure out, like why the grass doesn't start fighting with each other for space. And the grass seeds come from other grass seeds. And yet they figure out how to interact where every blade of grass has its space and does not impede in the others. You could think if you throw a lot of seeds, you won't have that. You will have that in different organisms. For example, we know today that coral reefs, for example, coral do go to war. Even though once upon a time we thought they were just peaceful and docile, today at night they're nocturnal. You can actually see in high-speed cameras how they go to war with each other. So you could see that there is sometimes a fight for territory. But in general case, especially the same species, they find a way to coexist and everyone has their space to grow. But in an unhealthy environment, sometimes homes with insecure parents will create insecure children. It's almost inevitable. And as a result of that, what you have is a situation that creates boundary issues. That's what we'll call them, boundary issues. What are boundary issues? That at some point it becomes difficult to know when you should be yourself and when you should be deferring to someone else. As a matter of fact, many people who grew up in homes where their identities never allowed to develop and mature and really become a strong self-confidence, what do they usually do? They often react to the other extreme. They fight for their turf to the extreme. They don't tolerate others. You'll see this very often. Sometimes, it goes both ways. people who were so-called indoctrinated to be pleasers and always satisfy someone else and forget about themselves, often become constantly in their lives pleasers. But then big resentment is built up. So often you'll find the way people rebel go the other extreme, that they please no one. Like someone once told me, more than one person has told me, 20 years I had no voice. Now I don't care about anybody else's voice. It's completely my voice. So I say, so you're doing to everyone else what was done to you. Well, I need 20 years to do that, and then I'll even it out, and then we'll find balance. Obviously, it doesn't really work that way, because you're doing yourself own disservice, because you want to have a healthy relationship. You don't want to suddenly say, okay, since myself is so obliterated, I'm going to be so selfish now that I won't let anyone else into my life. Who are you really hurting at the end of the day? But it's an understandable reaction. It's an understandable reaction because it's a knee-jerk reaction to being hurt and being so-called stripped of your individuality and independence. So now you really become very firmly independent to the point of inflexibility. So the whole thing is a one big mess, as you see from this. And anyone is dealing with this one way or another. What I mean some of us maybe are pushing it under the carpet, that we're not dealing with it, but in some way or another it impacts our lives. And it's the big question, about this whole matter. Now, when you throw into the equation as well that we are social creatures, which means we are not, the Rambam's words, Maimonides says, Medini, Adam Medinihu. Medini is also from the word Medina, like country. We are social people. We are country people. We are people of communities, of families, of nations. And that's what human beings gravitate to. It's one of the saddest things. A person lives completely alone and doesn't have company and doesn't have others that care for a certain type of social interaction. Sociopath, or people who have real difficulty with social stuff, even on the autistic spectrum, is it's a serious thing, because it doesn't allow for the breathing and interaction that we all grow, that you'll see from children, how they play with other children, siblings, schoolmates. There's something about a social interaction that's very vital and critical to human growth and being a healthy human being. So that immediately tells you that it's healthy to have interaction with others, which immediately means that there is going to be accommodation. It means it can't just be my way. Interacting with another person, the key thing to teach our children and also as adults is that there's a give and take. You're one person, but there's also others. So, let me just see this a second. Right. So let's take a Talmudic statement, interesting statement. And this is on the deathbed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest sages of the Talmud. He was one of the few that were then there at the time of the destruction of the temple and tried to actually save it in one way or another, because he had in with the Romans. The whole thing, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he was passing away, so his students gathered around his deathbed, and he shared with them some of his final thoughts. And one of the things he said to them was, Halavai, may it be, that you should have upon you the fear, you should fear heaven and fear God as much as you fear other people. So here's a clear acknowledgement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, a great sage, a great teacher, a great person, a tzaddik, a righteous person, saying to his students, who are also great people, that as much as you fear God, I wish you fear God as much as you fear human beings, which means that all people in some way are concerned about other people. So if he was saying it to people who were not developed and were not grown and did not work on themselves, you could say, okay, but he's saying it to his prize students. So you see that there is an element in every person's life that he uses the word fear, that we are concerned about others. So even if you're a faithful person, and you're a godly person, and all that, nevertheless, it doesn't come close to when you see another person looking at you. And think about it. Even if you are concerned, even if you're a person, as I said, a God-fearing person, and you have standards and so on, it's harder to do something wrong when a person is watching you than to say to yourself, I know God is watching me. Even if you completely believe it. You know why? Because we're people of flesh and blood. And if there's someone that's sitting here and watching you, it's stronger than saying God is watching. Even though logically, God may be even more, you should be more careful of God because he sees more than another person. Another person you can fool. And God, you cannot fool. But the fact is, we know today, one of the great deterrents of crime are cameras everywhere. Now you can't just get away with things. There can be a camera anywhere. Like right now, I'm on camera, and there are times I don't even know I'm on camera. So therefore, that is much bigger concern for many. Why is that the case? And why did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai say it? Because we are human beings. And he was telling it to them because the fact is that, as I said, as spiritual as we may be, physical human beings are concerned about other physical human beings. And to the point of even fear. And yet you find in many stories, and in many even Talmudic stories, about sages who were fearless. And they were not afraid. Abraham was not afraid when they threw him into the furnace for his beliefs. And there are many that died, actually, and which is a big thing, Mordechai would not bow down to Haman. He was not afraid of him, even though everyone else was. And even though it could have cost him heavily, and it almost did, the entire Jewish people almost were destroyed by it. So you see there's also that side of things. And yet Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai clearly acknowledges, and not just acknowledges, tells this to his students. So you see that the Torah is more, I would say, more complex than meet the eye. It's not just saying, hey, you know what, just believe in God and everything else will go away. No, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai makes it very clear that I wish that you will fear God as much as you fear other people. So when you take all this into account, clearly there's two sides to the coin, and there's a balance that's required. But let's talk for a moment, if we can maybe go even deeper and dissect exactly what this fear is about anyway. Now, if you were, let's say you're working you have a boss, and if he thinks lowly of you, he can fire you. So obviously the fear there is you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your income. So you can somewhat justify the concern that you need to satisfy him. And even if it demands him or her, the demands may be not always fair, but that's life. You're working for someone, they can end up being demanding things, and yes, you may even have to take some abuse too. The question is how much abuse to take, and is it worth the price? That's something that can be discussed. So that's a scenario. There's also other fears of people that you're dependent on. So there's the concern, will they continue to deliver, whether it's a client or whether it's other dependencies. So there you can somewhat justify and explain because there's the need you have. It's not so much you can care about the person's opinion about you, it's that you care that they don't sever ties and not hurt you in some way by doing so. So that we can address. That's I wouldn't even go there as much because that's something that can be addressed. And the question then is, as I said, what extent? You take any form of abuse simply because the person is writing your check? Obviously, a healthy person is not going to take every type of abuse, and there is a line. What's more complicated to address is when the fear of the other people or the person has no practical implications. It's not because you'll be fired. It's not because anything will happen. It's just the fear of being different, the fear of standing out, the fear of being mocked and laughed at. As a matter of fact, the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, the entire code of Jewish law, begins, Al yevish mepnei hamaligim, don't be embarrassed by those that will mock you. In other words, when you stand up for your values and you live by your traditions and faith and dress a certain way or behave a certain way, there'll be many people who may mock you and say, hey, look at this person. And it's a very big challenge because nobody wants to be in a room where others laugh at you. What really is the fear there? It's not because, as I said, you're going to lose something like a job or money. There's a fear because, as I said before, number one is we're social people. And a normal social person doesn't want to be laughed at, doesn't want to be humiliated. The Torah speaks very strongly about humiliating someone. Malbim pnei chaver barabim, which means it literally means to make a person go pale in public. But that means embarrassing someone. So their face becomes pale or they blush. So if the Torah said, hey, don't care about anyone, so why would it be a crime to humiliate someone? You could say, don't be humiliated. Be strong, and what do you care if other people laugh? But the fact of the matter is, as human beings, there's a thing called menschlichkeit, and it's actually a grave thing. The Talmud actually even equates humiliating someone to killing them. The expression is that the blood rushes from their face because they go pale, and that's a form of death. The blood is the life blood of a human being. So it's like in a way killing them. It's not killing them, murder in the literal sense, obviously, but in an emotional, psychological sense, humiliation, as we all know, is a very painful thing. So what exactly are we concerned? I'm not talking, of course, it's a crime for someone to do it to us, but why does it bother us when, as I said, we're not losing anything? As I said, the main reason, one of the main reasons, I'll just give a few, is number one is because we're social creatures. At the end of the day, we do interact with each other, and humiliation is a form of deep hurt. So it may not be a physical hurt, but it's an emotional, psychological rejection by your own people or by people that are of the human race is not something that we take easily. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way we were created. We were not created to be oblivious. We'll talk soon about the extent of it and so on. Another factor involved is because it's like a reputation thing. It's an identity. It's your dignity. Somebody dismisses you or silences you or laughs and mocks and humiliates you. They're basically treading on your dignity. And it's like you deserve a certain amount of respect, and here people are showing disrespect. So besides, we're not even getting to about your ego being hurt or not. It's just a normal thing for a sensitive person to not be oblivious to their dignity being trampled on or in some way abused. So for someone to say, I'm so aloof or so detached that it doesn't matter if I'm humiliated, is that necessarily a healthy thing? No, because a sensitive person, someone who's so immune to it, you wonder what's the matter with them. Nothing can hurt them. They can't be humiliated. So there's a legitimacy to being concerned about what others think. What we're going to talk about, obviously, is the question of to what extent. To what extent? And that's, of course, the main point. So if you think about it, you can almost say it's not quite fully rational. Because the bottom line, as I said, even if you were to lose your job, and even if it was other factors, why should you really care about what someone else thinks about you? Now, you could argue if it was someone that you respected and someone you felt and held in high esteem, and they dismiss you or they don't respect you, that can be very hurtful because here's a person who you respect and you feel their opinion is valuable, and when it comes the other way around, they don't have any feelings toward you or respect toward you. So that's, again, another invalidation. But at the end of the day, what is really bothering us? The answer is we're not invulnerable people. We're not God. And we're not that complete and perfect that whatever others say, it makes no difference. We are not such people. We all know we have our weaknesses and we have our flaws. And therefore, when another person some way humiliates us or rejects us or laughs at us or does not accept us, it in a way feeds into our inner, deeper insecurities, which make us feel maybe they're right. Even when you may argue, and maybe a part of you says they're absolutely wrong, there's a certain question sometimes, a little doubt. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am. Maybe I am deserving of low respect. Maybe I don't deserve the dignity that I thought I did. So all this comes into play when in the issue of caring about what others think about you, whether you should care. Because on one hand, it seems that there are value in what other people think. On the other hand, the question is to what extent, which is what we're obviously going to speak about. So as you know, a recurrent theme, I always speak about this because it happens to be the underlying force of everything, is that if you don't begin with a sense of self and self-esteem, you definitely are not going to be able to handle others, mocking, dismissing, and it won't matter much what others feel or consider about you. That's how it is. So the key thing in life, therefore, is to build first your own sense of self. Now, if you think about it, this is one of the beautiful ways God created the human being, that we're not thrust into a world, in a hostile world, just like that. We don't come out of our mother's womb and suddenly have to build a life. We are nurtured in a home that should provide us love, validation, confidence, and all that comes with what good parenting does. And we'll address bad parenting, but that's the way it should be. So in a sense, if you think about it, the whole point of childhood is really the cultivation and the nurturing of a fragile, vulnerable human being to turn them into something, to turn him or her, young boy and young girl, into a being that has a sense of self, a confident sense of self. Not arrogance, not overblown or exaggerated pompousness, but rather it's just a sense of self. Before you send off a bird to fly, you first has to first be nested and has to be cared for there are animals in truth that very early on are almost set free. But in most cases, it makes a lot of sense that you need to have those early years of the nurturing. So if you think of it in a healthy, perfect way, think of it like a gardener and a garden. When you first plant a seed, those early stages are the most important stages because they're the most vulnerable ones. A seed has to catch. So you can have weeds, you can have worms or other predators that easily will destroy that fragile seed. So that's why a good gardener, especially in the early stages, has to really take care and nurture the seed, water it, make sure the earth is fertile and healthy until it catches. Once it catches, and once you take care of it, you still have to take care, but there comes a point where you can see that it can begin to grow on its own. It's exactly like it is with children. So if you think of it, what we're doing in the early stages of life is building a structure, building a confident individual. That's the key to everything. If that's done right, then you can expect to create a balance as that child grows and begins to interact with others, how that interaction won't be out of whack. If that's not done right, God forbid, the balance and the boundaries are always going to be messy. That doesn't mean we can't realign, and that's, of course, we're going to be talking, because I'm not talking here to kids, we're talking to adults. But it's important to know how it is done initially in a healthy way, so then we can figure out what to do if when the situation is not exactly healthy. So again, in a healthy situation, the first thing you have to build the self of an individual. And that's simply done not through creating anything new, by nurturing, by validating, by respecting, by encouraging that young child to explore, to find their voice. You'll see little children always look for acknowledgement. They always look, are they doing the right thing? They look to a parent, and a parent sneers at them or in some way dismisses them. Those are very painful moments. And if it's continuous, what you're doing is undermining the child's self-confidence. So obviously a child is going to make mistakes. But the way a parent deals with those mistakes is even more important than when you deal with good things. How do you deal with a mistake? Do you just dismiss the child and laugh at them, which unfortunately parents can do, or yell at them? Those are not the ways that make a person grow. You have to find a kind, gentle way to teach them this is not the way to do it, there's another way to do it. And sometimes you do need discipline, but all discipline has to come with love, because discipline without watering the garden is not going to work. Because discipline and so-called starving the growing child, how can that be a positive thing? So you have to continue nurturing, but you have to also direct and guide and teach and incentivize and also create deterrence for bad behavior and so on and so forth. So the key is those early stages. When that's done right, everything becomes easier. Because now you have a child, whatever, let's say 4 or 5 years old, who has a healthy self-esteem as much as a child that age can have. And then when they begin interacting with other children, let's start with that, or their brothers and sisters, so they're not fighting for their turf. They're not saying, I have to take everything from another person because I don't have anything of my own. They were given the right and the honor to be able to have something of their own. You'll often see children who are very, very demanding and always grabbing toys from others. It's not the only reason, but often it's traced to the fact that the child has been deprived. So when they finally have the opportunity, they don't know how how to do it in a disciplined way, so they become very, very grabby and very demanding and extremely takers and so on. Now, another factor that can cause that, obviously, is also parents who spoil a child or never say no to a child. So, of course, the child starts creating a sense of entitlement, gaining a sense of entitlement that everything is mine. That's, of course, the other extreme. That's where it's also, you're not really nurturing the child. What you did is basically the easy way. Anything goes. So a child like that is also not going to have a healthy boundary when it comes to others. So those early stages, done right, really is the secret to a very healthy balance of how much you really care about what others think about you. And you'll see in direct proportion, without question, the less nurturing there was of a young child, or even not a young child, a child, guaranteed the more they care about what people think about them. And the more the nurturing of that child, the less they're going to care. Now, when I say less going to care, not in a way of completely not caring, because as I said, there's a healthy, we'll talk about that shortly, there's a healthy need to care what others think, because that's a way that keeps you honest, and that's a way that keeps you in the social norms of relationships. If you don't care about what a person who loves you thinks, that's equally problematic. But we're talking about caring to the point that you have to adjust and shift yourself and lose your identity in the process. So again, in direct proportion of how one's self is developed will be how they need the approval of others. The less they have of self, a sense of self, the more they'll need approval because they're desperate for others to approve. It's basically they're seeking the approval of their parents that they never got. If you want to put it in those type of psychological terms. Now obviously I'm painting it in a little more starker terms because it's the only way to discuss it. But in truth is, there are subtler forms of what I just said. And if you look into your own life, you'll find such forms. You'll find how sometimes you do something to adjust to another. You know, part of the reason I'm talking about this is because, as I said at the outset, it's one of the unspoken discussions, this matter. So just awareness, guaranteed, next time you interact with people, you'll see, watch yourself. How are you interacting? How much are you so-called deferring? How much are you trying to please? How much are you afraid of rejection and so on and so forth? You know? So the first thing is to establish that sense of self. Now, obviously we have to talk about a situation where one does not have established a sense of self. So then, of course, there's going to be a distortion, but it's not all lost. It's not doomed. You know why? Because at the end of the day, you could adjust it. If you are aware of the factors that are involved, you could start correcting it. But I'll talk about that a little later because I don't want to confuse matters. So now let's assume a person has more or less a healthy sense of self. So now the question is, how does that fit in with others? So I can't resist the Chelim story of the guy who goes to the mikveh, and he's a person who suffers a lot from self-awareness, and from an identity crisis person who doesn't really know who he is. In his whole life he's looking for an identity. He sees somebody, that's maybe me. Another person, that's maybe me. He's always looking to others to find a way to figure out what he is, instead of looking inside. Okay? Now, he goes to the mikveh one day, which is the ritual bath, and he's getting undressed before he goes into the water, and he says, 1 second, I know who I am when I'm dressed. I dress, when I'm in this mood, I dress these clothing. I'm in that mood, I dress different garments. He has garments for every occasion. But once I get undressed and go to the mikveh, I come out, how will I know who I am? You have to take this with a grain of salt. It's obviously a psychological story. Okay, so he decides, he's going to tie a little red thread to his toe. Now don't ask me, in a mikveh you're not supposed to cover any part, but in this story I guess is a pekuach nefesh, so I guess his fear of lack of identity gave him liberty to tie a little red thread to his toe. That way when he comes out of the mikveh, he'll look for the red thread, he'll know who he is. Okay. As I said, take it with a little imagination here. Fine, comes out of the mikveh, but as God would have it, the red thread untied from his toe and attached itself to someone else's toe. So he comes out of the mikveh and he starts looking for the red thread. And he sees the toe. He says to the other person, I know who you are, but who am I? So this is essentially an analogy of a person who identity is determined by externals. It's like You're wearing the wrong set of clothes. You're wearing my clothes. Hey, are you me or I'm you? You know, that type of thing. So, with all the jokes aside, the fact of the matter is we do have such identity crisis at times. And the fact is, very many people, I've heard this from, I don't know, countless people, they say growing up in a home like I grew up, with a very strong father, or a very strong mother, or both, or neither, they really created a person that I don't really know who I am. And maybe I'm just a product of what they wanted me to be. And I don't even know if I've made choices, because every time I made a choice that was not like what my father wanted, he made sure to remind me of that. And I really don't know if I am me or I'm a product of that. And it's a very good question if you think about it, because how could we know? So that's why it's so vital that when a person has that sense of self in a healthy way, that's going to be the foundation, because then everything is around that orbit. Because you have then a strong sense self. Now the question is, how is that going to interact with others? So that doesn't mean there won't be conflicts, but at least you have something to go by. Because if you have a shifting foundation, rest assured, you'll never find peace. Imagine every building in the city here, the foundations would shift, and one day a building is here, another day a building, you know, every time you come, it's like a change of scenery. You can't build anything when there isn't an unwavering and strong foundation. Here in this case, the strong foundation is that self. So now once you have it, so the child goes to school. And yes, let's say they see another child and that child has something this child wants. Now, obviously children can behave in wild ways, and that child, even though they have a good sense of self, may grab something from another child inappropriately. So what will healthy parents do? They're not going to say, you deserve anything and you can grab anything from anybody. They also won't say, don't have that desire. Good parents will say, look, you have things that child doesn't have. That child has things you don't have. And if you want to share what you have to give to that child, you can ask for that child to share with you. Now that's the language you speak to someone that has a sense of self, and that's how you teach them to interact. What is the worst thing you could do? Is, like I said before, either say you deserve everything, you can grab anything you want, because you're that sense of entitlement, or no, you're not allowed to have anything else, everything is, you can't share it with anyone, you can't expect anyone to give you anything. Those are not healthy boundaries. So this again is all contingent on there's a sense of self. Now, that sense of self has to know how to learn to interact with others. But if there's no sense of self, you can rest assured there's going to be a mess in how you interact with others. You know, like I told somebody, you're looking for a soulmate. And I say, do you know anything about your own soul? So I remember someone telling me, that's why I want a soulmate. They'll help me learn about my soul. I said, no, it doesn't work that way. You know, that would be very nice. You need to know a sense of self. You can't just say, I'm going to marry someone and they'll help me define myself. There you got yourself all the problems in the world. Even though there are marriages like that, there are people who are very secure, and the other party is very insecure. And they seem to work. Why? Because one person is so-called the boss, and the other one defers. I don't know how long that can hold and how sustainable it is, but sometimes that's called a dysfunctional relationship that seems to be mutual. Because one person is very passive, one person is very aggressive, one is very demanding, and one is very yielding. So, I mean, I'm not a believer of such relationships, but they exist. But as I said, I don't know if it's a healthy relationship. And even if it works for them, I don't know if their children will be able to learn from that, because it's the real serious boundary issues there. And I believe that ultimately has to give, because the resentment has to build. There's no way that a person can live their entire life. I mean, I should qualify that. I've seen people do that, but they basically swallow and they simply give up on themselves, which is its own painful thing. But the point I want to make is, what is the healthy version? The healthy version is, as I just said, a self that now has to learn to negotiate and navigate in a world where there are other selves. Now, obviously, it gets complicated, because even if you have a healthy sense of self, and now you have a friend that doesn't have a healthy sense of self, what do you do then? But again, if you have a strong foundation, it's easier to navigate. You know, sometimes you meet somebody that's a narcissist, and you have to make a decision. That person you're not going to be able to have a really equal, even relationship with that person, because they'll always want more than they give. And you have to make a decision. So if you have a healthy sense of self, you say to yourself, Okay, I know what that person is like. I'm not going to change them. Is it worth for me to have engaged with them or not? You may decide it's not. And in a very respectful, cordial way, bow out and say, fine, call me. Or I'll call you, don't call me, whatever it is. I'm not talking about how you exactly did respond to that. If it's a relative, then obviously it's a little more sensitive. But if you have a healthy sense of self, it's much easier to handle because you at least know what direction you're going. In fact, that person doesn't know direction, but you know your map. You know that joke they tell, a woman calls her husband, he's on the highway coming home, and she says, George, hey, be careful, the news just said there's a guy driving on the wrong side of the highway against the traffic. And he looks out the window and he says to his wife, don't worry, it's not one person, everybody's driving the wrong way. He was the guy. You understand? So he thought everybody else was driving the wrong way. So sometimes when you don't know the way you're going, obviously you think you know your way. But if you do have a clear sense of, it's like, think of it this way. Let's say you have a clear GPS, a psychological, emotional GPS, you know where you want to go. And you embark on your journey, you're traveling. Then somebody joins you in the journey. A friend, a stranger, a relative, whatever it may be. And that person suddenly says, no, right now we got to go left. And you know that you got to go straight or right. What do? So you could say to them, listen, you go left, I'll go right, and that's that. Or you could say, I'm pretty sure to know that this is the way I have to go. I can't force you to go with me, but this is where I'm going. But if you don't know which way you're going, obviously, having with you a partner that doesn't know is like the blind leading the blind. That's why it's so vital to look at yourself, because that's the big problem. What happens is we sometimes start looking to others, and that's where you get into a mess. What are you doing? The blind leading the blind. You're suddenly concerned about the opinions of others who don't know where they're going. Tell me, is that not insane? So if you're concerned about the opinion who knows where he's going and you want to learn from that person, so fine. Find a way to learn from them, find guidance and coaching. But to suddenly say I'm going to care about people who don't know where they're going, that is a problem. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. But then you think about it, you say, okay, so I have to find my way or find someone that can help me find my way. I'm not going to hook up with a partner who doesn't know where the hell he's going. What's the point? Pardon the expression. Is that right? Okay. Just for effect, it was important to use that word. Sometimes you have to use it. Doesn't sound good in Yiddish. To where the Gehenna he's going. It doesn't sound good. Maybe there's some version of it. Anyway, you think if they Google now hell, it'll come up this video? That's what I'm thinking of. Hell, Rabbi Jacobson. And they'll find this class. That's how you'll always remember. Yeah. So as you see, the key is to find that self. That's the key. You don't have that, nothing else is going to help you. That's why it's such a beautiful blessing in the Torah when it says, Re'ei anochi nosen lefnechem, in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy. We read it in the summer months here. It's basically after the 7 weeks of consolation, the weeks after Tisha B'Av, the sad time of the year. A very long time ago. Back. So what it says there, Re'ei, behold, I bestow upon you today the blessing and the curse. And then there's other expressions, that you have 2 paths. The path of life, the path of opposite of life. Ubacharta b'chaim. You have these expressions in the Torah, very much in journey-like language, like a journey, a trip. So a question is asked, whenever it says Neisen lefnechem, when I bestow upon you, I give you, Neisen is from the word matana, a gift. So to say the gift of blessing, great, but how could you say that the gift of non-blessing, of curse, is a gift? It's not a gift. And the answer is very simple, but very powerful. The gift is clarity. The gift of knowing what path to go on, and the gift of knowing what path not to go on is an equal gift. As a matter of fact, to know what path not to go on can be even better gift than the path to go on, because you don't get into trouble. So it's not the gift of the curse, it's the gift of knowing this is a curse and don't go there, and choose the path of life. So it's critical, that's why you find these expressions, to choose the right path, find the right path, or find people that can help you find the right path. Obviously, the best possible scenario is parents from young age teaching you that sense of self, because when you know your journey, it's a lot easier to navigate when you get into other situations, or you meet somebody and they say, I have something great for you. So you have good instincts. You have a good, as I said, inner GPS that can say, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know if that's for me. But if you have no sense of self, and then suddenly you're very thirsty and hungry for something, and someone offers you something to quench your thirst, and you have absolutely no clue, you could end up taking something very toxic, very addictive, that can really hurt your life, with good intentions, because it came from someone that had no direction. You had no direction. This sounded good. Now we'll all make our mistakes, but the more clarity you have on your journey, where I'm going, and where I shouldn't be going, that really creates a far better way to interact with others and be less concerned with what other people think. That's the key. So, what happens if you don't have that? As I said, awareness of a problem is half the cure. If you indeed feel that you're a person that does not know where you're going, and you're somewhat wandering, and therefore the concern is you're going to meet other wanderers, and they may not help you, and you're going to start being very deferred to them, or worry about what they think. Just like, as I said, the blind leading the blind. The blind one is worried what the other blind one thinks, when the other one doesn't know, is worried about what you think, and you're both going nowhere. I don't mean to put it in that type of extreme situation, but you get the idea. If you know that, then the question and the simple thing you're looking for is someone with clarity, someone objective that you can talk to, or someone that does seem to know where they're going, and you can hook up there and try to participate in that journey or learn from it. And there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. That's how we grow. Till now you feel that sense of self was not really emerged yet, so it doesn't mean it's over. Now you have to find that self. Now, if you're overly concerned with what other people think, you can rest assured that probably the self is not really fully intact. But someone that has a sense of self will have no problem knowing when to learn from someone else and when not to. And now that brings me back to the value of caring what other people think. So I spoke about caring what other people think for non-healthy ways, which really means a very simple litmus test. If you care what other people think and it doesn't help your life to find clarity and grow, rest assured it's not coming from a good place. If, on the other hand, you care what other people think, and if you care about what other people think, but it leads you to grow, then you know there's something in that's positive. So when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to his students, Halavai, may it be that you should fear God as much as you fear others, he was speaking to healthy people, not just healthy people, great scholars. He was telling them a very important fact, that we care more about what others see, because they're right in the room with you and they're watching you, than God, even though you may believe in God, but God is invisible. And there's always a little part of you that says maybe God is not fully seeing, or you ignore it, like the Ganef, the thief that prays to God to help him succeed in his theft. Go explain that. How does that work? God said, Lo signev, do not steal, in the Ten Commandments. You're going to pray to God to help you do what he told you not to do. It's somewhat a little insane, right? It's one thing saying, okay, the principal isn't watching. God may be not watching. I'm going to steal while he's busy there, Or like that joke they say, the kids were in the lunchroom, and there was apples and cake, and one of the kids, and everyone was supposed to take one apple, one cake. And one teacher saw that a kid took 2 apples. So the teacher said, God is watching. Put back an apple. So the kid whispers to another kid, take a few pieces of cake. He says, why? He says, God's watching the apples, he's not watching the cake. So that you could steal. So in other words, you could deceive yourself into thinking that the principal's not watching. So fine. But to invite him in and say, hey, you told me not to do it, and I'm inviting you in to help me do it, what kind of thing is that? So actually the Talmud does say that a person does not sin unless they have a moment of insanity. Because it is really, it's like you're saying to yourself, a moment of blindness. You're convincing yourself that's not being watched, and therefore I can do it. Or you decide to ignore it because the temptation is so strong, you don't think straight. However you will explain it. The point I'm making is that Rabbi Yechon ben Zakkai was telling them a truth that they need to know. And there, it wasn't about, he's saying to them, yes, be afraid of other people. That's not what he said. He said, take a lesson from your fear of other people, learn from that you should fear God that way. That you should actually know that God is harder to access at times, but you should try to work at it and realize God is just as present as other people, if not more. So there is an element of conscience and shame. So I'm not talking about humiliation. No one has a right to humiliate another person. But to say you're completely oblivious of what others think, that's not necessarily the sign of a healthy, independent self. When it goes that extreme, that a person says, I'm so independent, I don't care what anybody thinks at all, that ends up becoming somewhat arrogant, and you can also end up hurting people. The sense of self I was talking about that's healthy knows what Hillel said. Im ein ani li mili, yes, it always begins with that. That's why it's the foundation. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? You need to have that sense of self. But immediately it has to be countermeasured with another voice, a statement. If I'm only for myself, what am I? Because we are social people, and we are people of relationships, and a relationship is not going to work. Just like it won't work if there's no sense of self, it also won't work if you only have a sense of self, and there's no room for another person to grow. Like I said before, you teach the child, you have something, the other person has something. You may want that, so there's give and take. You share, they share. What was Midas Zdaim? The Mishnah says, Zdom were the Sodomites. What were they? They're the wicked city of Sodom. They said, what is yours is, there's two opinions in the Mishnah there, but one of them said is what is mine, what is yours. That's Midas Zdaim, according to one opinion. Why is that? What's the problem with that? Because it means I'm self-contained. I don't need you, and you don't need me. Don't come to me, I don't come to you. That's not how the world works. The world is a symbiotic world. Bees pollinate flowers, and they feed off the nectar, and then they help the flowers feed each other. Everything is a give and take. We breathe air, oxygen, that comes from the photosynthesis of leaves, and so on. Everything is symbiotic. So it sounds fine, you know what? I'm so self-contained. Me, shali, shalcha, shalach, and that's that. No, that's not appropriate. Obviously saying what mine is mine and what yours is mine is definitely what he says there is cruel and wicked. But even that type of self-contained, no, because we are interactive people. God created a world that interacts, relationships, a marriage. A marriage, you need to have that give and take. That's exactly the point. Two different type of people, each one has a strength the other one doesn't have. So this balance, but it's interesting, Hillel could have started the other way around. He could say, if I'm for myself, I'm nobody. And if I'm not for myself, who am I? He could have said like that. He could have said, if I'm only for myself, what am I? If I won't be for myself, who will be for me? He began because first you need the self. First you need, like they say, to get on a plane, first put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on someone else. You need to have that self. Chayecha koidmin. You have to first subjectively take care of your needs, not at the expense of others, but simply build your nest. You have to build your home, your hearth, your security. Then you can begin to interact with others in the right balanced fashion. So it is ultimately a balance between knowing that yes, it's important what others think, especially when it comes from only when it comes in healthy ways. If it's just conformity to the masses, herd mentality, because everybody's walking this way, you're also walking this way, what benefit is there? Then you're just succumbing to yet another form of self-annihilation. Everyone's doing it, you're also doing it. On the other hand, to be so self-independent that because everybody's doing it, you say, no, I'm not going to do that. No. There is an element of respect of the majority, the respect of values that others may have. And therefore, knowing those boundaries is the key. Now, I'm not going to suggest that there's just a simple formula that could always figure it out, but I will say, the stronger your healthy sense of self is, the easier it is to navigate and figure it out. Okay, it's not guaranteed. You could always make a mistake. You could always think, hey, you know what? The community or the group says something. Maybe I should follow that. And then you find out that was not a healthy choice. That happens. It happens. I just gave a scenario, for example. People have children in schools. And sometimes you have to deal with a conflict. The school you think is doing some type of injustice, something inappropriate. And should you fight with them? Or should you just give in? And sometimes you feel given because the other parents gave in. And then you realize it wasn't good for your child. You realize, I should have put my foot down. And sometimes you don't want to do it because you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to make everyone uncomfortable. You also don't want anyone to punish your child because you were that way. But sometimes you have to make that move. Sometimes you have to take your child out of a school because of that. So these are not easy decisions to make. When do you defer? When do you not? Sometimes you'll hear very clearly, and I always respect this, when a mother is very strong, says, for my child, I know this is not good. And the father will say, I don't know if it's so bad. Now, unless the mother is being completely hysterical or irrational, often an instinct of a parent is a very good thing to work with. Not guaranteed, but it's something you can't ignore. Because sometimes a mother or even a father will have an instinct that this is right, this is not right. So I'm not suggesting it's simple, but I am suggesting there are parameters that can help you develop this. So it's really about figuring out how to look at yourself and realize, no, you don't care about what other people think and their opinions because they are other people. You care because they may enlighten you in something that you may not see on your own. That's the key. So it's not just this type of blind, obedient, a bunch of people, and that's coming usually from weakness. Now, there are times you may not know. I say, you know what, I'll defer to the group. As I said, that has to be done with discretion. And if it's a group that has not hurt you and you think that they are healthy people, there's maybe a wisdom in that. I'm not suggesting it's always wrong. But you have to think about these things. If it's just some blind obedience where you're just blindly following because it's easier, that not necessarily leads you to great and healthy places. So everything is this type of interaction of understanding first sense of self, knowing that you're also subjective and therefore you need another opinion. And that itself, sometimes if you want to say, should I follow what others are saying or should I follow my own voice? Maybe get an opinion of your mentor, of a friend, of a therapist, of a teacher, a rabbi, someone you trust, and say, what should I do in this situation? My community wants this. I think I should be doing this. It's a good question. And this is an issue that affects everybody on earth. People who live in very strong religious communities obviously are very much influenced because there's a lot of pressure. There's peer pressure to fit in. And there's lines, they blacklist you. You could be excommunicated, so to speak, either physically or emotionally and psychologically if you don't toe the line. And that line may be completely ridiculous. It can be things that are so superficial. I remember in high school, they had us read this book, The Lottery, the short story, The Lottery. Any of you read The Lottery? It's one of the... So what's The Lottery? It's a very chilling story. It's a short story. Briefly, it goes like this. You don't know the punchline until the end of the story. That there's this little town where, beautiful town, men, women, and children, everybody goes to work, school, parties, everything. But the story begins that they're all preparing for this special one day a year, like their Rosh Hashanah or something, like their New Year's. And the children, everyone is buying new clothing, and everyone knows that day school will be closed. You don't know what the day is about, but it's a special day. And you can see the anticipation in the air, and building up, but you really want to know what's going to happen on this day. Anyway, everyone's waiting for the day. Everyone dresses their finest the night before. They're dressing their finest, and they all prepare. They're all dressed, holiday clothing. They all gather at the middle of the town. And a lottery, everybody throws their name, puts their name in a lottery, and they choose one of the names. And what happens next? That person goes into the circle, in the center of the circle, the whole town around them, and everybody has stones, and they stone that person to death. Now, for no reason, it's not a crime. Once a year, that's what this town does. That's how the story ends. And of course, the teachers immediately, what does it teach us? It teaches us blind conformity that makes no sense. And of course, it teaches you about not stoning, but different communities have this type of thing. And everyone does it for generations. And this is all part of the story, how the children learn from their parents, and their parents learn from their parents. Just basically people blindly doing this. And the most chilling part is, after they stone that person to death, everybody goes back to their homes, Yom Tov is over, And they go back to regular clothing, back to school, as if nothing happened. So, it teaches you what human beings can become like. A little, not quite the same way. The story of the Lord of the Flies has a similar element to it about the children. But this type of group herd mentality. I mean, we don't need more chilling than the Nazis 70 years ago. 100 million people. They were not all bad people. But when there's a certain amount, when there's authority, and there's a propaganda, and there's a concerted, deliberate effort to demonize innocent people, people can do anything. And unfortunately we've suffered greatly for that. And that is why we know very well the horrors of conformity when it's being led by someone like a Hitler, Yamach Shemai, or something like that. Obviously that's an extreme. But conformity has other forms that are not as extreme, but they have the same problems, where there's no more groupthink. Everyone read 1984 from George Orwell. Groupthink, that's it. War is peace, love is hate, hate is love, and that's it. You don't ask questions. If you ask questions, they perform a lobotomy on you. So you have a whole situation of people just blindly following something that has nothing to do with anything rational. So obviously this is a very dysfunctional, unhealthy version. And they use al tefresh min hatzibur, don't break away from the community. That's a nice justification. But the Talmud's not saying that about an unhealthy community. If the community is going to stone someone irrationally, you absolutely should break away from that community. That's why we have a Torah, we have standards. It's not just blindly, because everyone's doing it, that's why it's fine. This is one of the big excuses in history. Everybody did it. What do you want from me? Well, Abraham didn't. He stood up to the whole world, even to his own family and friends and parents and so on, because it was not right. Mordechai. Now, we're not necessarily always going to be on that level. When the previous Lubavitch Rebbe was imprisoned in the former Soviet Union, and when they pointed the gun to his head and said, Rebbe, this pistol here has changed many people's mind. So he started cooperating. And the Rebbe, without flinching, said, with a loaded gun to his head, and completely, there's no due process. He didn't have a lawyer there. He could have been shot in the spot. And he said, this toy, he said tzatske. In Yiddish, tzatske is a toy. He said, this toy can frighten someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone that has one God and many worlds, or two worlds. And he meant it. And his captor was actually a Jewish communist anti-Semite, spoke in Yiddish, says to the Rebbe, Rebbe, nun zen veret esfir. We'll see who's going to prevail. And the Rebbe looked at him and said, yes, we'll see who will prevail. And what do you think happened? Within a few months, that guy was killed. And the Rebbe was miraculously saved, ended up coming to America. I wouldn't be here today if it were not for that. So sometimes you don't see it right away. Now, this is a man, a Rebbe. He had the presence, that strength of personality, that you're not going to scare me with a gun because you can't take away my soul. You can take my body. You're going to take my faith. And that faith has prevailed over all these empires who had a lot more power and a lot more pistols and guns and ammunition and so on. So that's the attitude. Now that was that circumstance. This doesn't mean that you don't at times need to understand what others think, but you're not going to let them determine your values. But that's only when you have values. If you don't have values, or you don't have a foundation upon which to stand, going back to the healthy self, obviously it's going to be extremely difficult to know where to give in and where not to give in. So to sum up, the first thing is we have to work on the self. Who are you? What do you stand for? What do you really believe in? And so start with a very simple question. What are you absolutely sure of? That you know no matter what, you will never compromise. It's a good question to ask yourself. We live in a world, in a country where many people, you ask most young people in this country, or for that matter, older people, what are the three most important things in your life? And I've this question. This is not a scientific survey, but you won't believe the answer. The answer is sexuality, money, and sports. And not necessarily always in that order. But that's more or less what most people say. Think about it. All temporary things, all very nice. They bring pleasure, they have a beautiful side, they're not necessarily even criminal. I didn't say anything that was criminal. You could have healthy sexuality and so on. But it's interesting that the word truth is not there. The word soul is not there. The word of anything that's permanent, like building a healthy family and a legacy that will live on forever, isn't that important? It's not the top three. So when you ask yourself, what really are you ready to fight for? What do you really believe in? It's not easy to answer in a comfortable world in which we live. But that's where you start building your foundation. That's yourself is defined by your priorities. It's as simple as that. What are your true ultimate priorities? Because we get caught up in life, especially when things are easy. Most of our day we're working and making money. Even though that's not our priority, but that's what we do. And then we have other stuff. We have distractions and so on and so forth. So building that self is the key, and that it's never too late to do that. You don't have to be 2 years old to build it. Obviously, it's easier to build it from the ground up, young childhood, but you can build it wherever you are in life. And that begins to be, then you know that for sure. Then you start saying, what about the other things in my life? You know what? This may be optional. A lot of things we're doing right now that are like, to us, indispensable, actually could be very optional. You can live much completely without it. But you need to first define what it is that you are sure about. Then you could say, you know what, here's the second list that I have. I'm not so sure that I must have these things. Even making that exercise alone will free you a little, because you could say, hey, 1 second here. What am I involved in? I think these are so important, and my real priorities I'm not really doing. I'm busy with that. So right there you got yourself a picture, a snapshot of your life. These are the things these steps are critical to help you begin to navigate properly. And once you have that in place, you could then say, okay, I have friends, I have colleagues, I have other strangers, whatever, people in my circle, and I could start saying, what value do they, what importance do they have in my life? Are what they're expecting of me necessary? Is it part of my priority, or is it not? Is it just I'm just trapped there, and I have to just fit in because that makes me feel good? You see, once you have that foundational element, it's much easier to determine. It's like having the foundation of a building. Now you can determine, do I need a first floor, a second floor, a third floor? What should be on the first floor? What should be on the second floor? But you can't do that until you have your foundation in place. Because then everything wavers. Then you know what, maybe not, maybe yes. The more you can define things that are absolutes, it's much easier than to figure out the things that are not absolutes. And figure out what belongs and what doesn't belong. Now, I'm not suggesting looking for perfection, but you're looking to improve your situation. You're looking to be less dependent on others. And the only way to be less dependent on others is when you're more dependent on yourself, where you should be dependent. And going back to Hillel, yes, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But then, if you have that self, then immediately you say, you know what, I need on my team this and this person. You'll see people are very insecure. Some of them say, I don't need an accountant, I don't need a lawyer, I don't need an advisor. I can do everything myself. I'm smart enough, I'm smarter than them all. Now, you hear someone say that, they're usually either very immature, or very young, or just a plain idiot, or so insecure, they can't even believe that it's possible that someone else. When you look at the great people on earth that have really achieved things, in any circle, you'll see they have the best team. That's what they have. Yes, they have self-reliance on certain fundamentals. If they have to make certain decisions, they make them. But you'll see they build the best team. They'll find the best lawyer, the best accountant, the best advisors, the best medical, whatever it is that they need, because that's what it's about. On the contrary, the more secure they are, the better the team will be. Andrew Carnegie, first billionaire in America, I think. So he built a big steel empire in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Hall. He's the single-handedly big, great philanthropist, and he also single-handedly built the public, I don't know if you know, the public library system in the United States, because he felt that knowledge is power, and many people couldn't go to school, so free library, they could go and read. And at that time, it was considered, today you have internet and all that, but library was a very big foundation that gave many people opportunities they could never get because they didn't have the money to go to school or to higher education. Anyway, before he died, his lawyers asked him, what do you want, epitaph on your tombstone? What do you want written there? So he said, make some suggestions. So one said the first billionaire, the builder of the public library system, the philanthropist, all kinds of different title things. He crossed it all out. You know what it says on his tombstone? A man who knew whom to hire. It's quite impressive. And he was not a stupid man. He made big decisions and so on. It's controversial in some ways too. A man who knew whom to hire. I found that to be gewaldig, because it's not how great you are. It's how great people you gather around you, and you build that type of power and team and so on. So it's all about, so the self actually becomes the springboard to actually finding others that help you become and achieve what you want to achieve. That's the interesting paradox, because that's how healthy things work. Look at the human body. What's a healthy human body? The brain does everything, the heart does everything, the liver does everything? No. Every part of your body knows it needs every other part, and they work perfectly. God forbid, if they don't, we have disease and illness and sometimes to tragic results. So it's the diversity, but the diversity with everyone knowing there's a give and take. So if the organs all got together for organ convention and said, you know what, let's experience unity. Everyone's going to be the brain for 1 week. Then we're all going to be the heart. And then we're all going to be the lungs. And then we're all going to be the liver. Then we're all going to be the gallbladder. I don't know, whatever. What would happen? You'd be dead before the convention began. God forbid. The whole point is, no, you be you, I'll be me, and we'll work together. That's the key. Like the Kutzker Rebbe said, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am not, and you are not. But if I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, I am and you are. You got that? What that means is if you define your identity by proximity to others, meaning, you know, that's what someone says, like I know people that they say, so what's your opinion? They say, well, let me hear everybody else's opinion, then I'll tell you my opinion. What they really want to say is, once I hear everybody's opinion, I'll tell you how I disagree. The Ipche Mistaverniks, they call them. People, they say, you tell me what you think and I'll tell you why it's wrong. So the joke goes, when they come up to heaven, God says, no, tell me something you learned, something you studied in yeshiva and Talmud. They say to God, you tell me something and I'll slug you up. You tell me something and I'll contradict. They're very good at contradicting others. What about your opinion? Their opinions are always juxtaposed around other people's. So you have to be I am I because I am I, not because you are you. And then, and you're you because you are you, then we can come together. Love and relationships is exactly like this. One individual, another individual, and they come together like that. Not like that, and not like that, like this, like two links in a chain. And each one strengthens the other. Now I understand that's a perfect scenario. There's always going to be challenges, but that's what you're looking for. You're not looking for either complete isolate, everyone's just on their own, or everyone is crowds the other, and that you don't have any type of independence. One expression the Rebbe once said, when you're close, when you should be distant, you'll end up being distant when you should be close. We all have in relationships the times we need our space. If when we need our space, you try to forget it, respect that, meaning when you need not distance as in being detached or apart, meaning just, everyone has their little cave. Men need their caves, women need their cocoons, whatever it is. If you try to intrude and you try to break those boundaries, then when you want to be close, you won't be able to be, because it's all that dance and balance. Individuals trying to find a symbiotic, a type of symmetry to work. And that's nature is an example, our bodies are an example. Look at nature. How many different systems that work? Look at our bodies. And yet they work together. We have free will. So, musical notes, they work together, one beautiful symphony. But imagine the musical notes decide, one musical note says, you know what, I got to go for a trip. I'll let you know when I come back. And then another musical note decides it's not going to play its tune. What are you going to have? So that's more or less what the human race is like. We're a bunch of musical notes, and we more often don't choose to play together, or on the conflict. So, should you care about what other people? Should you care about what others think? As I said, yes. If it helps you grow, and if it helps you find objectivity, and it's a standard that helps you elevate, but not if it's a standard that just helps feed into your own insecurity and just a crutch of a herd mentality that just doesn't lead you anywhere. So we should all be blessed to find that the individual song that we all have, and learn also to find the other people that can help you identify it and the courage to sing it and then give what your special energy. Hanukkah is coming. Saturday night is the first night this year, and what's about the story of light? Each candle has its story, but each candle they come together. Look how what flames they meet. They become like they melt into one. You know, they say the difference between a song and a speech. When somebody speaks and others start speaking, you have is chaos. When someone sings and everybody joins in to sing, it's a harmony. So it's like flames. Two flames melt into one, but they are two separate flames. So it's a combination of individuality plus the synergy of it all. So we will have a class next week. If there's any changes, of course, I'll announce it. We'll light the menorah. We'll have a little Hanukkah here. And everyone, please be blessed with the courage of being yourself, but also the courage of knowing how to embrace everybody else in this type of harmony and unity. Be well, a good week, and a happy Hanukkah. Thank you. Yeah. You could take a pause, a moment of silence. Oh, I didn't mean that.
All these people, when they get older, they become refugees. I guess it's like they were social at one time, like the actresses, and then they become refugees.